this evening, if you were worried that we really weren't going to get fully into the 21st century, we do get into the 21st century tonight. So any fears that you might have had should be allayed tonight. And so, as you see, we're talking about data valence and surveillance capitalism. So in other words, any data-driven surveillance. I want to make some comments about surveillance capitalism, and I also want to give some illustrations. I have too many here for this evening, but I think we'll look at national security surveillance and yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe humanitarian surveillance. There are several topics that I have ready to talk about, but we'll see how we go. So you know what platforms are. I mean, once upon a time, platforms were raised areas from which you could speak, or they were structures in a train station where you could get onto the train. But today, everyone thinks of platforms as something different. It designates a particular kind of business, and the kind of business is tremendously important. The kind of business that gets called a platform is a company that uses an application or a website from which a service is offered. More exactly, they're businesses that provide the hardware and the software for others to operate on. Such platforms have grown hugely, exponentially in the last decade and a half. And they're, as you all know, a prominent feature of 21st century society. Platforms depend on data from beginning to end. And those data are gathered from multiple sources, and platforms are inescapably surveilled. It's their business, although many of them would not describe themselves as being surveilled. But if we go with the definition that I gave you, or two definitions I gave you the other day, then clearly they are surveillant in important ways because they make people visible, and they analyze what they find out about people, and people get treated in the way that they are represented. So a little bit more could be said about platforms. Over the very short history of platform companies, they have shown a very marked tendency to become monopolistic. They tend to be monopolies, and even to view themselves as going beyond mere economic activity to undertaking some government-like tasks. I already mentioned this in relation to smart cities, for example. These household name giant corporations now dominate stock markets as they trade in gathering, dissecting, and reassembling massive amounts of everyday data generated by, well, you know who, it's us, which in turn starts to shape the lives and the communities of those who provide the data. Frequently, of course, not knowing that we are providing the data that we are providing. And of course, platforms also depend on their popularity with millions of people around the world, because they wouldn't have grown so much if people hadn't been so enthusiastic in using platforms. They answered a felt need that was already generated by other corporations, and sometimes it was the corporations that became platforms that were the ones that generated greater interest in platform companies. They produce generally easy to use interfaces on online sites that offer quick and satisfactory solutions to the needs for all kinds of services, from keeping in touch with family and friends to ordering a ride or finding an overnight stay. And when circumstances change, platforms can be very quick to change with the circumstances. So, again, you're all aware of these things. The pandemic happened. What happened? Overnight, companies like DoorDash, Uber Eats, Deliveroo, ChowNow, and all the other myriad delivery companies suddenly sprang into life. Some of them didn't exist before the pandemic. And so they can be very quick to change the way that they operate or to provide new services. And of course, people were very grateful for that, especially at a time when people were nervous, frightened, fearful of what could happen if they did go out in public and so on. So that popularity of platforms shouldn't be underestimated then. Although consumers may move from one platform to another when they become dissatisfied, I mean, there can be small dissatisfactions that lead people to change, or large ones like Elon Musk taking over Twitter, which was pretty heavy duty in terms of the, well, I guess you all saw the complaints in the Twitterverse when that occurred. The steady rise in smartphone use indicates clearly that the appetite for usable and trustworthy platforms seems to be undiminished, and they appear in all kinds of areas: education, journalism, conventional TV and radio, as well as all manner of commercial ventures have altered their content and their style to accommodate the platform world, surveillance and all. And one way to think of this, what is a new development within capitalism, is to talk about data-driven surveillance. And of course, I think it's a particularly helpful way to think about this. To say it's data-driven does not mean that it is somehow autonomous, that it's running itself. The data are deliberately gathered so that they can be analyzed and used for particular purposes. And the ways in which they are analyzed and used is always using algorithms. The algorithms are critical to the way in which those data get used. It's difficult to overstate the significance of this hyper-modern development, which is a close cousin of what is now called surveillance capitalism. Okay, so let me see. I see. Oh, it's not going to be on here. Just, oh, whoops. There she is. Okay. Do you recognize this person? Most of you do, evidently. Some of you don't. It is from an episode of Black Mirror. This is Lacey. And Lacey is smiling. So it must have been a clip from the beginning of the episode, not the end. She was a very unhappy person by the time it came to an end. So, surveillance capitalism has certainly been noticed by Black Mirror. And in this episode of Black Mirror, I think some aspects of surveillance capitalism are very clearly portrayed. So, if you haven't watched the episode, then if you are feeling strong, then watch it. If you're not feeling strong, leave it till the day when you do feel strong. In the America in which Lacey lives, all interactions are rated on an app that syncs with a device that allows others to see the rankings in real time. So it's not like a hidden deal. If you were in a restaurant, for example, and you click that you're going to tip the wait staff, then it isn't the case that the wait staff immediately knows how much you're tipping. In the world of Lacey, everybody knows very quickly who is getting what, how people are being rated, and what the consequences of that are going to be. So, Nosedive speaks to something that is very true of 21st century development. And today, as you are already well aware, quantification and ranking are everywhere, especially on social media. That is the way that social media work. The system that is being used in the Lacey episode, which is called Nosedive, on Black Mirror, the system depends on accumulating likes, as with any social media, and one's reputation is built up or blasted by your peers. So it's other people who are either generating more likes for you or diminishing the number of likes that you get. Pretty straightforward, but not good if you're lazy. And she works hard the whole time to boost her scores. She is so aware of those scores, and she just cannot drag herself away from the machine as she hopes to get more and more likes. She, is preening herself in front of a electronic mirror. And she highly rates those who serve her coffee in hope of a return rating. Remember, everybody is being rated. She'll make sure that the wait staff get a really good tip in order to increase her rating that the wait staff give her. So it's reciprocal rating. As you will have suspected if you haven't watched the thing, her luck runs out. And the world turns savagely against her, refusing her access to services. First, the ratings drop, and then she's getting, at an increasing rate, negative ratings, which lower the whole thing more and more. Devastating for anyone, especially someone like Lacey. So she ends up being shunned in public and is generally made to feel like a failure and a misfit. She's not a happy camper. Most discussions of the Nosedive episode see that unsettling resemblance to social media and the ways in which everyday life is vulnerable to the amplified judgments of others. Self-curation and affirmation seeking are commonplace features of a social media saturated world. So the consequences are unsurprising. One's social standing, one's acceptability for employment, and access to services increasingly depend, in part, on that precious peer-produced persona. The platforms that collect data originating in likes, followers, preferences of all kinds expressed online sell those data to other corporations, and that information circulates among marketers. Police and government frequently have access to using those same data for different purposes. This is hinted at in the Nosedive episode. Everything. It's all about Lacey and her troubles. But what is valued in the broader world of social media and other platforms is the sought after raw data material for all manner of judgments. So while the nosedive satire accurately lampoons social media and a social media addicted world, there's another reality behind the everyday quantification. Many modern societies are indeed dependent upon quantification, rating and ranking, which in turn depends on that massive data surveillance. But it's not merely or even mainly data or peer produced. The whole edifice of contemporary marketing depends on evaluating consumers with a view to determining their lifetime value. Now, the idea of a lifetime value of a consumer is not new. It isn't a product of the social media world. It's a product of the 1990s. In fact, I said I was going to keep you in the 21st century, but there you go. This came up in the 1990s, the idea of the lifetime value of a consumer. And this is a key thing that companies are wanting to know. Because if your lifetime value, in other words, your likely continued custom that is going to increase at a rising pace, if that is true of you, then obviously you're a more desirable customer, and the companies are going to do all they can to ensure that they retain your loyalty. Okay, you remember loyalty cards from a different era. This is loyalty cards on steroids. So what you are worth to the corporation determines how the corporation treats you. And the scoring is based on all sorts of activities, whether you're shopping, drinking coffee, or ordering pizza, staying at an Airbnb, or using Uber. Anything that people engage in on a regular basis is going to be important for this. And that's the basic drive of surveillance capitalism, drawing our attention to the success of internet corporations or platforms. Everyday involvement with phones, tablets, laptops, and other devices such as fitness apps, digital assistants, and so on, are a conduit, not just for personal data as occasional discrete bits of information, but for a flood of details about who you are, where you're going, what music or movies you prefer, who your friends are, and so on. Internet companies obtain these data at a minimal cost, hardly costs anything to them, but what they get is very valuable. And the most successful companies are selling most of their data to other companies. They're not even using it themselves. The most significant platforms are selling their data. That's where they make their money. So there's another very important woman that I want to introduce to you. If you thought Lacey's hair was interesting, then Shoshana Zuboff's hair is very interesting. She is the author of the book that I mentioned a couple of days ago, The Age of the Smart Machine, back in 1988. And this Harvard professor went on in 2019 to produce The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And she had already set out the basic thesis of the book in an article in 2015 in the journal Information Technology, and then the book came out 4 years later, in 2019. What she does is to analyze Google's business model. That's probably the most important aspect of the book, her analysis of how Google works. Now, it has to be said that her analysis is fascinating, at times I find pretty scary, but it also can be questioned. So there are aspects of it that people have criticized and questioned, such as that she listened too carefully to some of the people who were telling their story from within the high-tech companies. That's a common criticism. So that she's a Harvard professor. She spent her whole life researching corporations. And so she's used to talking with corporate leaders. And so some critics say she didn't listen critically enough to some of them. So I'm just saying that while a lot of people read this book, and I think it's a really important book, there is a fascinating debate around Shoshana Zuboff's work. For example, if you look at the journal I mentioned yesterday or the day before, Surveillance and Society, several people queried her main thesis from a surveillance point of view in articles. Each of the people who wrote with some critique of her work was also very complimentary about lots of aspects of the book. And in fact, one of the three people who writes in there is a Brazilian. He's at University of Campinas, and he's Rafael, several other names, Evangelista. It's a very nice little critique that he makes of Shoshana Zuboff's work. She's a delightful person to be with. We've spent time with her, and Sue and I have had dinner with her. I first encountered her, as it were, on a very sad occasion. I was going to a conference in Belgium, and I was going to give my own paper, but just before the conference, like a day before, I'm still in Canada and the conference is in Belgium, I had a message from one of the organizers saying that Shoshana Zuboff's paper was not going to be given by Shoshana Zuboff because, tragically, her husband had just died and there was no way she was going anywhere. And the organizer said, so we're wondering if you would give a talk and kind of channel Shoshana Zuboff's ideas. One of my worst gigs in terms of, having to speak on behalf of someone. So I spent 24 hours doing nothing but reading stuff that she had written before, because this was a year before the book came out. But yeah, I have a lot of admiration for her, and she's a good friend, but she's rightly questioned and criticized, and she knows where I question her work as well. So what she did, as I say, is to explore the Google model of what she and other people called surveillance capitalism. She wasn't the first to use the word surveillance capitalism. It first was used in a much more Marxist journal, Monthly Review, in 2014, so a year before her book in information technology. The authors of this piece in Monthly Review brought out a really interesting discussion of surveillance capitalism. And one of my colleagues from Queen's also used the term surveillance capitalism. A really good colleague who also sadly just died 2 weeks ago. So I am sad that he's gone, but he was also in 2014 writing about surveillance capitalism. So yeah, it's a concept that really helps us an awful lot to understand what's going on in our day, but it's also one that is bound to be subject to critical discussion. So I'm saying it's worth checking out the different views of what surveillance capitalism is all about. And some people who write about platform companies are really writing about surveillance capitalism, and they would prefer the term platform capitalism to surveillance capitalism. So there are different ways of thinking about this, and I'm just telling you that as a as a favor, really, because I think it's important to know when a new theory comes out what the different views of it are. And if you want to know about those, I can certainly tell you. So she shows how internet companies obtain access to the real-time flow of data in the hope of influencing a person's behavior for profit. The companies believe that getting their hands on the data will enable them subtly to alter people's outlooks and activities such that they become more and more dependent on the goods and services that they produce and market. Flags raised by this go beyond the notion of privacy. They include a potential for undermining self-determination of ordinary consumers like us, and even democracy. Part of Zubov's argument is about the threats to democracy of surveillance capitalism. And I would go further than her in discussing that. I think it's even more dangerous than she thinks it is. Surveillance capitalism, she thinks, encourages a kind of illiberal mode. It is questioning some fundamental ideas from what in the Western world tends to get called liberal democracy. As surveillance capitalism spreads, as the critics warn, it erodes the limits and legal regulations of government that were once placed on commercial practices, because it is so different and it has moved so fast. Those limits and regulations include binding contracts and understandings between corporations, employees, and consumers. The problem is that social participation, if you think about areas like employment or healthcare or education, now largely depend on internet access and the use of tools that are privately owned by corporations. If you're dealing with a platform, you're dealing with something that is privately owned. And that private ownership is seen as a license to do all kinds of things that may or may not be, in a conventional way, legal. The surveillance capitalist future, in a sense, is a worst-case scenario, albeit one that many companies emulate. Any who aspire to be like Google, and if you were a capitalist entrepreneur, who wouldn't want to be like Google, really? If you want to be like Google, then you also want to use profuse amounts of data to increase your operational efficiency, as well as to gain insights into consumer behavior and preferences. But many companies that want to get onto that bandwagon have a hard time doing so. Why? Because they started out long before the platform surveillance capitalism boom. And if they're already in existence, they have old methods to deal with. What can they do about their old ways of operating when these new companies are moving very fast into the very lanes that they were once in? And so it's a very disruptive kind of economic development. And after all, not only in the so-called global south, but also increasingly in the global north, whole populations rely on the benefits of the online world for their daily interactions with all kinds of service providers. If the logic of surveillance capitalism and capitalist accumulation really does come to be based on involuntary and invisible extraction of data from ordinary users by these private corporations, the tensions between participation and exploitation are likely to create new cleavages and conflicts. And of course, we've seen that happening already. So what happens when a company becomes data-driven in this way. I'm going to look back a little bit at the story of how this occurred, and it'll become clearer why I'm using quote marks for the words data-driven. And then, as I say, I want to look at some application areas where people actually use these methods for data-driven activities. So until the early 21st century, the internet was used mainly as a source of information. You could find things out easily and quickly, from news and weather to stock market reports to how things work to historical facts, genealogy, all sorts of things were available as information that you could find from the internet. But Web 2.0, that depended on user-generated content, was quite different. It caught on at the turn of this century. And it was the one thing that got the internet corporations, or would-be internet corporations, out of the mud that they had been in. They were having a really hard time. In those years, the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about the, I can't remember the name of it, but the kind of boom and bust of companies that were managing to start up and then crashing. It was a time of huge turbulence, but as soon as Web 2.0 came into being, things became much less stormy. There were storms with the competition, but the actual corporations were doing a lot better for themselves. Data, of course, had been around for several decades in a digital form, or what was coming to be called a digital form. Their potential for profit-making and new modes of analysis was realized, and with it, eventually, during this century, the notion of big data was born. And Google was arguably the first corporation to work out how to monetize data that had previously been regarded as kind of data garbage. It was referred to in the industry as data exhaust. In other words, the stuff that comes out of your exhaust pipe if you're still driving an entirely gas-driven car. Just exhaust. And what Google did was to harness that exhaust and turn it into something super valuable. So all sorts of agencies quickly became interested in the sorts of things that Google was doing and what Google was producing. As I say, healthcare, national security, whatever. And they too became interested in extracting value, different kinds of value, from the vast volume of data now deluging the internet. The various practices that are associated with the blanket term big data have many surveillance outcomes beyond social media programs in predictive policing, consumer analytics, data-driven national security, big data, healthcare, among others. And unfortunately, data analytics of various sorts are often seen as a kind of savior. This is going to rescue us from the current mess that our particular area of the economy is in. Others added descriptors to the data to say what was important. So if you look for early definitions of data, and particularly big data, it had to do with volume, the 3 V's: volume, variety, and velocity of data. So in other words, it really was big. More and more data was being collected of a huge variety of kinds, and with the new affordances of the increasing speed of the internet, greater velocity of movement of those data. So the 3 V's were often seen as kind of critical descriptors. They're only descriptors. They don't explain what big data is, but they describe it. In case I don't add I forget to add one. To my mind, the big one that is missing is vulnerability. So if you're talking lion, then add vulnerability as another key factor, because as I think we can show, the vulnerability of certain already vulnerable people in the population is increased as big data has been used increasingly. So that's my, warning V. And some people in the big data field trying to make those three look a bit more respectable than just volume, variety, and velocity. Some add veracity, which I think is also a good one to add. Is it actually true? Does it actually produce information that is worth having? You may have come across it's a very famous poem by an English poet who once wrote in a poem, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? No, it starts as, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is the knowledge that we have lost in information? And because he wrote it in the 1930s, he didn't know to add, and where is the information that we have lost in data? So to my mind, and to the mind of some, I think, quite responsible data scientists, there is a kind of hierarchy that acknowledges that information is better than data because it shows how the data are connected. But knowledge is more important than information because it is based on a broader range of findings than mere data. And wisdom, of course, is more important than knowledge because it tells you what sorts of knowledge are worth having in the first place. So anyway, I told you to stop me if I appear to be going off on a tangent, but there's an important tangent perhaps. If we were trying to define big data, then something like what Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford, two theorists whose work I like a lot, Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford, one American, one Australian, they talk about the capacity for researchers to search, aggregate, and cross-reference large data sets. So there's what's actually going on. That goes beyond the descriptive words like velocity, variety, and volume to tell us what's going on. It's a capacity, it's a possibility for researchers to search, aggregate, and cross-reference large data sets. So there's a bit of a definition, which is more like a definition. It's a capacity of a very large scale collecting and analyzing data from many possible purposes. And some such purposes have obvious human benefits, from understanding climate change to improving public health to relieving urban traffic congestion. However, care is still needed because big data interventions are often accompanied by a mythology. And that mythology, communications specialist Jose van Dyke calls data-ism. So not just data, but data-ism, the belief in data, if you like. And in fact, she talks about it as if it was a kind of religious belief in data. Jose van Dyke, she's a Dutch professor in communications and data. So she thinks that there should be real explanations in any kind of knowledge. In other words, some kind of theories about the causes of things. Whereas, if you're in the world of big data, what you're looking for is mainly correlations rather than causes. And that, of course, is a generalization, but it's a key thing to look out for if the search for causes has been replaced with a search for mere correlations. At the same time, in the realm of dataism, data is often viewed as neutral or disinterested. To indulge in dataism is to suppose that just having access to data and the means to analyze it offers big advantages. But data are never raw. The idea of raw data is, I think we can argue, an oxymoron. It is internally contradictory. Because data are always cooked. They're never raw. They're only data because somebody wants them to be data. They're only, the datum is the thing that is to be explained, the glass, the object, the thing. It's the thing to be explained. And so if you think of data as raw, then you're forgetting that to count as data, somebody has already said that this, and this are data. So in this room, there are various kinds of things. There are the seats you're sitting on and the desks. And together, they make up something that we call furniture. But it's not furniture until we have some kind of an explanation of causes and not just correlations. So, and those data are cooked in the first place in the sense that they're chosen. They don't just appear from nowhere, but they're also cooked in the sense that they're analyzed using algorithms. And so there's more than one sense in which we have to think about data in such ways. The algorithms are the codes that solve the problems that those using the data want to solve. The algorithms are a bit, I don't know if you cook. I cook. I love cooking. And I sometimes use a recipe, but if I don't use a recipe that's online or out of a book, I also prefer them out of a book than online, but the recipes I use for making dinner are frequently ones that are in my head, because I know them well, and they're, my favorites. And so I have the instructions in my head, okay? The algorithms are like recipes. They're the instructions. They're what you're going to do with the data, just like the recipe is what you're going to do with the ingredients. Okay, so that's the kind of thing we're getting at when we talk about algorithms. It's a recipe. You've either tested the recipe, and that's how I end up getting the recipes in my head, because I've tested them several times, and Sue and I sit down for dinner and we discuss, well, is this good? Are we enjoying this? Yeah, a bit too much of this, not enough of that. So next time, remember, change the algorithm, change the recipe. And so it's altered as you go along, and you're hoping, any maker of an algorithm is hoping that as they improve the algorithm, they're going to get better results. Just like I hope when I cook dinner, I'm going to make something with better results because I've improved the recipe. Now, the algorithms can be used in all kinds of settings. Algorithms can be used in laboratory science. So in other words, where you have a whole set of situations that you're in control of. You have whatever the materials are that are being put together or are flowing from one container to another or whatever. It's always under, if they're under laboratory conditions, then they are controlled. However, the kinds of things that happen with these data in a big data world are far from under control. If we're talking about big data in policing, for example, that is hardly a world where you can predict the results like you can in a laboratory. So think about it. If we're moving something that is normally done in controlled circumstances and apply it in another area, then what's going to happen? There are going to be risks that you didn't have in the controlled environment. I hope I'm not laboring it, but I think it's really important to think of the ways in which we move from talking about data as if it was, some kind of, in the first place, some kind of neutral thing. It isn't, it's already cooked. Sorry, we're using your cooking analogy in different ways this evening, but never mind. But in the real world, where things do end up, as we know so well, being highly unpredictable for all sorts of reasons, the idea is still to try to apply data. So what it means is the kinds of algorithms that are being developed have to be increasingly complex algorithms in order to deal with, whatever it is, the flow of vehicles on the highway when there's an accident. That's not a controlled situation. You can't predict when that accident's going to happen. Although, of course, when it comes to predictive policing, police hope that they can predict in advance who might be about to break the law. So let's try to just situate this a little bit more. If you go back to 1988, an Australian computer scientist, a guy called Roger Clark, introduced the concept of data valence. So in other words, surveillance using data. He's another of the computer scientists that I respect a lot because of his commitment to social responsibility in computing. He believes that we should be socially, politically responsible in the way that we do computing. I won't go into the reasons why that is frequently not the case, though I'm tempted to, but I won't. He used that word, data valence, way back in 1988 to describe how increasingly populations are seen, made visible, using data rather than direct means, such as physical hearing or seeing. Little did he know how much this would expand in the following decades. Visibility was rapidly enhanced at industrial scale, especially as surveillance of operations of all kind became more automated and data dependent. And by 2013, the extent of global data surveillance in the service of national security became strikingly clear. Why? Because the National Security Agency of the United States of America and its partners suddenly found themselves in the spotlight, and there were global shockwaves. Many argued that data were being gathered on travelers, this is after 9/11, of course, apparently indiscriminately and illegally. In other words, not within the legal bounds of then existing privacy and data protection law. Although the NSA and other agencies denied that what they were doing was illegal. It was a time of considerable conflict over what was legal and what was not. Take the use of the air handler, for example. Now, an air handler is a device that is added to a military drone's surveillance arsenal. And the air handler is intended to suck up available wireless data traffic in a given area. The air handler is placed there by the National Security Agency, and they receive the data. An air handler is something that is operating in this room right now. It's the return valve in the air conditioning system. Okay, so that's where the word air handler came from, and so you can see why it would be appropriate to use that metaphor for sucking up data and the return valve, as it were, of those data. So, if indiscriminate gathering of data is one feature of so-called big data surveillance, then the move beyond targeted and systematic data collection, which is what security agencies were doing in the 20th century, is another. This is generalized surveillance, including all sorts of people who might certainly not think of themselves as requiring surveillance by national security agencies. And it's often called mass surveillance. Maybe a better word would be suspicionless surveillance. In other words, putting someone under surveillance without any suspicion that they might have done something wrong or be about to do something wrong. If surveillance beyond borders was already a signature of surveillance at a global level, then this portends surveillance without any limits. And then a final feature of what I've been saying is that data are mined and analyzed, well, I have said this in part, using algorithms. It's always been necessary to work out how to focus a surveillance operation. But in earlier times, the trail of coding could be traced back to the police, the marketing agency, the intelligence agency, or whatever, that initiated. But now algorithms are used that themselves may be enhanced by AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning methods. So not only are the data possibly dubious in the first place, now how they are handled is partly within an automated system that often leaves very little room for human discretion. So we have moved a long way in a couple of decades, and the matter of national security was a key dimension of that. The algorithms are needed, as I say, because without them, analyzing those mountains of data, to use another metaphor, for patterns and correlations would be impossible. But as analysts sometimes acknowledge, even they don't know how and why algorithms work. They're essential tools, but they're not fully explicable tools. And they're invisible, of course, seen only from their inputs and their outputs. You can't see an algorithm. You can only tell what it is doing by what it spews out at the other end. In everyday life, people become aware of algorithms when, YouTube will autoplay the next video after the one that you had intended to watch. Algorithms, machine learning, are embedded within human-created purposes. They're not created in a vacuum. And as I say, national security organizations use algorithms all the time. They collect huge amounts of data, requiring algorithm coding for interpretation. Terrorism, which is, of course, a terrible thing, is a relatively rare event. So if you set the rules, the algorithms, for interpretation in one way, if you set those rules too tightly, then the terrorists may strike without any warning. But if you set them too loosely, if you set those algorithm parameters too loosely, then many other innocent people may get caught in the dragnet. So it makes a huge difference how the algorithms are set in very sensitive systems. It's not a straightforward activity at all. Who knows whether algorithms are to blame for some people who are wrongfully on no-fly lists, for example, or worse, subject to extraordinary rendition and torture. I don't know enough about Brazil to know if people have been caught in that kind of trap, but Sue and I have met personally one person who was subject to extraordinary rendition after 9/11. It was American, he was a Canadian citizen, but he originated in Tunisia, and he was taken while he was at JFK in New York City, and he was removed without anyone knowing, including his family, to where did he go? They took him to Tunisia first and then to Syria. And in Syria, he was tortured. He was stuck in jail for a whole year. I mean, it was a complete error. And, so these things actually happen. We know him, and his partner was a member of my research team for some time. So that's how we ended up knowing him. But, really, really serious errors can happen. And of course, the National Security Agency in the US is so withdrawn within itself, it never let on have that error happened. You see what I mean? It can be a matter of life or death. He could have died in the torture in the wretched Syrian jail. So, a slight change in the algorithm could make a huge difference. And that's why we need to be thinking about these things super carefully. With data surveillance, the data image or the data self, what we've been cheerfully talking about as our data selves and so on, can become a crucial determinant of life chances as well as life choices, related to your consumer purchases, but it can also relate to your life chances as well in numerous contexts: healthcare, education, and security, policing, whatever. The actual activities of the human body became less critical as video surveillance and computer monitoring, plus today internet and social media, including voice-activated assistants, scrutinize everyday actions, permitting and denying access and eligibility as a result. These technologies of control open doors and close doors in everyday life. I think in all these things, the critical factor is going to be the data record. And that's why we should all be concerned about our data records, but even more so, we should be concerned that our agencies that are supposedly trying to work out how to control and modify and engage with these surveillance practices are actually pursuing goals that are feasible and necessary. So there are several levels of task for all of us here. Data become implicated, as I say, in social sorting and social ordering in new ways. Inequalities may be ameliorated, but also deepened using new data analyzing methods. So after we've taken a break, we'll look at the predictive policing and humanitarian examples, humanitarian organization examples. Those are two good ones. There's another one is to look at, I don't know how far this affected you in Brazil, but there was it sort of did in a second-hand way. There was a major controversy in 2018, around a company called Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was engaged with Facebook in producing a way of understanding the American population, a data-based understanding of the American population. And those data were then subsequently used. They were gathered by Facebook, and then they were used by this company called Cambridge Analytica to create profiles and to determine which people should be approached for particular attention during the run-up to an election. And so it was a kind of data, the ways that elections could be skewed by the way in which the data were handled. And the question was Cambridge Analytica and its work really responsible, or in part responsible, for two things. One, the vote for Trump in the US, and two, the vote for Brexit in the UK. I don't think we'll ever know the answer, but there's a strong likelihood that both those votes were affected by Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and their system. So there are lots of, if you're interested in that area, you can follow it up. There's a lot of really good material on that. And in one of the research projects that we did in our center, we looked very carefully at that whole business. So yeah, I could give you other examples, that's all that I'm saying, but I think we'll stick with predictive policing because, several of you are in law, and therefore it's an interesting question to ask about predictive policing and humanitarian aid. In a world where there are more people than ever on the move as they become refugees, it's a major global issue of where people can go who are on the move as refugees. So many countries are involved. So that's why the humanitarian aid one is also a really interesting and important area. Anyway, we'll take a break for a few minutes and then just take a look at these two examples as our second part for the evening. Yeah, questions? Who had a question? Yes. Oh, I can't hear you. Just a minute.
I think I might have missed something in data. But you said there is no road data.
No.
There is no road data. But for example, if I use a fake ticket, road data or store data?
It doesn't prove
That's it.
The difference between raw and approach.
Yeah.
If you buy a vegetable at the market, then it's raw. It's cooked. It's ready to eat. That's all it is. So it's very common to hear, especially computer scientists, talk about data as being. But you understand what I'm saying? It is data too. It's good. You don't know what it is until something has happened. You've got to know what you're looking for. This is data, that is not data. For the purpose that you want to check. Okay? Sorry, I'm glad you asked. Maybe more than one person was confused. Yeah.
I apologize for my British, but my job remains in the power structure after the database era, because we have a new liquid society, maybe because of the postmodernity. I don't know exactly. I'm not a philosopher. I don't know pretty much of this area, but I need to know, because in the pictures that you showed us in the past lectures, we have like a centered structure of power. Even in the bank and panopticon, we have a tower in the middle
Yeah.
that watches everything. In the surveillance category, does the power remains like solid centered, or it's like tangible? I don't know if it's
Oh.
pertinent
That's good.
for our lectures, but it's about.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's really good. Don't apologize for it. It's a fine question, and of course, as with all good questions, it has lots of answers. But the answer is no. It isn't. One tower. It's not a panopticon in that sense. It has many faces and many characteristics. It's diffused throughout society as a political and economic practice. So it's highly diffused. But by referring to it as surveillance capitalism, you're referring then to the way in which capitalism is being strengthened as it relies on data. And so it's, and therefore one needs to ask the question, are the typical, how are the typical characteristics of capitalism changing as it becomes surveillance capitalism or platform capitalism? So in that sense, it is still a system of accumulation. It is still a system that depends upon there being sectors of the population who are much better off than others. It's a systematic, structural relationship. So although there isn't a single kind of all-seeing eye of this surveillance, there is a very strong political economic process that is totally involved with it. So do you see what I'm saying? It isn't like a dictator or the director of the National Security Agency or whatever, who sort of has a top-down view that is very powerful. It's diffused hugely, but what is being diffused is structurally informed as a new kind of capitalism. And the kind of capitalism that it is seems in many ways to be exacerbating, to be making worse some already existing features of capitalism. And it's an interesting thing, that Shoshana Zuboff is a profound critic of surveillance capitalism. But she is not as profound a critic of capitalism itself. She has been all her life in the Harvard Business School. That tells you a little bit about her background. But, they really don't like her at Harvard in the business school. She has never been someone who they loved as their favorite professor. She hasn't been. She wrote that book way back in 1988 about how the power of managers in the corporate and industrial workplace were increasing in power, and the workers were increasingly disadvantaged because of the automation that was taking place in the factories. I mean, that's not going to go down very well with some of the people in Harvard Business School, I can tell you. So, but the thing is, at the end of the day, she is not a. She doesn't believe that the aim of political action should be to get rid of the basic competitive urge to accumulate more and more in competition with others. She doesn't believe that that needs to be dismantled for a good society to come into being. So, you know, the Marxist authors that I mentioned who preceded her by a year or two in describing this thing called surveillance capitalism, I mean, they do take the view that until capitalism can be fully dismantled, human beings are not going to be able to develop truly fair societies. So it's not, you're absolutely right. It's not, it's a very diffused system, but it's still a system that is profoundly powerful in its own way. And it depends on surveillance. And the surveillance can be very unequally distributed and create or reproduce already existing problems. I already mentioned it. Things like facial recognition cameras. They already distinguish. Now, of course, those things can be changed. But yeah, anyway, that's a good question. I had one, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We see that the main character, she lives in a bubble that her parents all behave the same. So my mainly doubt about surveillance cap is why does it wants to kill diversity? Why it's interesting to kill diversity, make all the mass behave the same?
Because I manipulated it.
Well, yeah, it's a manipulated, it's an artificial environment anyway. So, but yeah, it's a good question, and we could also spend all evening discussing that. But it's, you know, I think that's a great question. But it's sort of like the other question that I think we always need to be asking deeper questions than are frequently asked, certainly in the popular media, but even by, you know, responsible journalists. I think we need to be going deeper than their analyses, and then we would begin to answer those sorts of questions. But, you know, maybe that's just the professor saying that. I happen to believe that, you know, data is one thing, information is another, knowledge is another, and wisdom is the other, and I aspire to wisdom. That's what, in my good world, it would be where we are all wise about the decisions we make and what we think of as knowledge, and which information we think is important for knowledge, and which data might help us. So I'm a bit upside down compared with the majority at the moment. But yeah, I did have one question for you people. I am really enjoying your company. I love chatting with you, you know, a couple of minutes before the class and after class and whatnot. But I have noticed that our class size is diminishing a little bit. They put the thing in here because lots of people registered who didn't show up. And then, you know, whatever it was, 24 of us, 25 of us showed up on Monday, and we have a steady attrition rate, and I hope I'm not driving them away. I'm hoping they have other really important engagements that prevented them from coming. But do let me know if there's anything that is making you wobble on the brink of saying, oh, well, I'm not going to bother coming next week, because I would really like your company next week, but I'd like to see your friends here too. If you have friends you want to bring, I know there will be more people on campus next week, and I'm not, obviously, it would be stupid of me to complain about absences to the people who are here, because you're here. You're not part of the attrition. You're part of the solid, loyalty group. Anyway, I do hope that I'll see you next week. So there's no lecture for the start of the weekend on Friday evening, and in any case, as I say, I'm going to meet some colleagues here. But Monday evening we're back on at 6. So let's say something about predictive policing then. It's about how data are used to say what sorts of criminal activity are likely to occur, where it might occur, and when it might occur. So it has a predictive purpose. So this involves mapping areas in cities, for example, to show where such activities might occur. And on the other hand, it includes identification, so that you can show which individual or which groups of individuals are likely to cause trouble, engage in crime, or whatever it is. Increasingly, the data feed for this comes from sources such as social media. It's widely used by predictive policing operations to use social media. For instance, if there is talk on social media about bars and getting drunk and so on, the GPS tags in the tweets, or whatever we call them now, indicate where the trouble spots may emerge, so that they can be mapped appropriately. Now, it's a trivial example, but it's the sort of thing that policing is engaged with. So if you imagine a scenario, a call out, en route to an emergency, officers use a smartphone browser to get access to a platform that gives details that will help them to prepare for what they find at the scene. That's what the predictive policing is for. So they have their phones and they have the app on the phone, and they're checking it as they drive fast through the city in order to try to do something, hopefully before the trouble begins. The platform has access to billions of commercial records, as well as to criminal and social media information, which it sorts and scores as the police cruiser is on the way to wherever it is. An algorithm will give particular value to the information coming in, and it will offer a threat rating of red or yellow or green, which allows the officers to be ready for what might happen when they get there. If it's red and it's in the United States, it may well be that they have weapons ready. But the stakes can be high, and the ratings will affect the police calculations about their use of force, for example. Interest in so-called big data policing has increased very rapidly, especially in the area of predictive policing. Allocating police resources may be done on the basis of such findings. One of the key systems is just called PredPol, short for Predictive Policing. It's a big company that makes that organizes the software. It was used in Los Angeles. Some places that have been using predictive policing from PredPol no longer do so. It's a fast-moving game. But PredPol is also used in countries in Europe, and I'm not sure if it is still used in Brazil, but some police departments in Brazil have used PredPol, so it's not unknown in this country either. It's used in Japan in some places, and in China for that matter. Systems like this are attractive to police departments who are trying to reduce the number of officers who are out in the city on the beat, as it's called, and to find new means of crime control. Obviously, if you can reduce the number of officers that are employed, you're reducing the cost of the policing. But the data quality, for the reasons that I already gave this evening, might not be very good. The data quality may be less than ideal because it's incomplete, or because it's biased. Some of these predictive policing systems use data that is in the police computers as well. So you've heard the phrase, I'm sure, garbage in, garbage out. If you put bad data in the first place, you're going to get crap results out at the other end. So there's an issue with the quality of the data, especially if it is simply coming from some previous police report that could well have been wrong, biased, all sorts of things. And if that's come into the predictive policing system, which it does, because they include already existing police records, then it may well be sufficiently incorrect as to mislead the officers, even as they're on their way to whatever this emergency is. And it may produce results that are mistaken, false positives, or false negatives for that matter, or the underreporting of certain kinds of crime might give a biased view of what the actual level of criminality is in a given city. And as some data, as I say, it comes from on the beat, ordinary police officers doing their thing, putting their reports into their phones or their tablets or their laptops, then subjective aspects, the view of the police officer, and I'm sure you have observed this as I have observed it, that police can jump to conclusions incredibly fast about some situations and go ahead with what they think is right when what they're doing is entirely inappropriate. It happens. Again, I have personal experience. I've seen it happen. So, given the evidence that police activities are in many places already somewhat discriminatory in their outcomes, for example, targeting certain minority groups more than others, it's not surprising that this kind of effect gets reproduced in the world of big data policing or predictive policing. The results of predictive policing are only going to be as good as the data that went into them in the first place. If the data is suspect, then the results are not going to be good. It means that self-fulfilling prophecies can come into being, that the expectation becomes a reality. And self-fulfilling prophecies tend to happen in police work especially in areas of urban disadvantage. And you know all about yours here in Brazil, just as we know all about ours in Canada. Problems arise in volatile environments where lots of things are going on and you don't quite know where things are going to go next. And lots of situations, both for security agencies and for police, are volatile environments. The data may be gathered from situations that are highly ambiguous or in which there are already misleading connotations. So although algorithmic policing sounds as if it's more accurate because it's based on complex data, it doesn't mean that it is less susceptible to error. I should say that if this is an area that is of interest to you, there is a number of really fine studies of predictive policing and people who've made very careful analyses of the strengths and weaknesses of predictive policing. One in particular by a fairly young scholar, Sarah Brain, like the human brain except with a Y, B-R-Y-N, no, it's not, B-R, brain, B-R-A-Y-N-E. So it's not like the human brain again at all. Forget it. Forget I said that. Yeah, Sarah Brain's book on predictive policing is quite recent and really good. And also, if you put that name into your browser, she has some really great articles about it too. But there's a number of people who are writing about writing in this area. And some government bodies have set up analytic and evaluative systems to try to see whether predictive policing is really worth it or whether it's really appropriate. So in the UK, for example, the Government Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation commissioned a study to try to work out whether predictive policing was something that they should support more. They reported some of the findings in 2019, showing how frequently the algorithms may themselves be biased. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, it was found in this study, may be algorithmically calculated to pose a greater risk of criminal behavior. But this is sometimes an effect of their having come into contact with public services more frequently, thus generating more data to which police frequently have access. So indigent people, poorer people, they're likely simply because of their social condition to have been in the view of police. And it may have absolutely nothing to do with criminality or, a desire to break some law or another. So much is needed by way of clarity, transparency, accountability, and so on, before predictive policing can ever be said to be reliably ethical and safe to use. It's very hard to tell how such methods, how far such methods can truly be effective, especially if so-called crime rates are taken as a guide. Many factors affect such rates, and isolating key ones is notoriously difficult. I'm just scrolling down through the sections that I'm missing to get to the humanitarian assistance. Okay. So, predictive policing. I don't know if you have any questions or comments on that. I gather from the nods and whatnot around the room that you were certainly getting the picture of what I was saying. Okay, well, let me say a few things about humanitarian aid before we close for the evening. I already said earlier this evening that the global migrant crisis has reached epic proportions in 2024. I mean, this is a key global issue today. In 2023, the UN estimated that the world contains at least 103 million forcibly displaced people. And that's not to account for all the other groups that are migrants or refugees. So that's 103 million forcibly displaced. 3/4 of them are from Afghanistan, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine now, and Venezuela. In October 2022, fighting flared up in North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Nyiragongo territory now hosts 177,400 people who have been displaced. And that number, 177,400, are in 2 villages, 50 kilometers from the conflict. They're uprooted from the land, which is their only source of subsistence. For humanitarian agencies, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, the urgent challenge is to address questions of accommodation. Where are these people going to go? How are they going to live? They need sanitation. They need healthcare. They need drinking water. They need food. Here, as in Kiev, as in so many other trouble spots in the world. And such situations demand effective and immediate action, for which biometric registration, usually using fingerprints, is increasingly seen as a highly efficient tool. It's an agile means of accounting for who has received what assistance, or for reconnecting families, and thus also it's good for audit trails, knowing what has happened, what resources have been given to which people, and therefore accountability. So it seems like a really good thing to use biometrics. Biometric data are highly sensitive, creating permanently identifiable records. For the European Union, for instance, this marks them for special care. Bodies such as Privacy International, one of the bodies that investigates issues of surveillance in many countries and raises questions, critical questions about them. Bodies like Privacy International have blown the whistle more than once on egregious use of biometric information, biometric data in humanitarian aid, making it an area of some controversy. So some people question it, despite the fact that it seems to have some good effects. But the ICRC developed a series of forward-looking policies to try to ensure that the potential misuses would be misplaced. I think we have so this is the place, in the place I just mentioned, Kivu, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there is an aid helper getting the biometric details of a child, judging by the size of the fingers there. So displaced and migrant people are right to worry that such details could be misused, for instance, by governments that obtain access to those data as a means of border control, for example. Because, let's face it, the refugee problem in the world is one that is constantly coming up against borders. People in certain countries don't want refugees crossing into their country. So, border control is another issue that is going to be affected by things like biometric registration for those who are on the move because they're refugees. And even the proper use of biometric data may be hard to justify. Restoring family links is a fairly straightforward and understandable use for the data. If you have the biometrics of someone who doesn't have any obvious relatives near them, biometric data is one way of helping to discover whether there is indeed a family that has been separated from this person or these persons. Increasingly, though, the efficiency of distribution of needed resources can be hard to defend, especially in organizations that have for a long time managed satisfactorily without such aids. The Red Cross, the International Red Cross, has developed not only its own data protection principles, so they've developed their own principles that relate to how the data should be used, just like a government might do for its own citizens. And it's also produced a biometrics policy to try to ensure that the data gathering is explained to those who are being given aid by the Red Cross, including how they can refuse to participate if they wish. Recipients of aid are given the dignity of recognition in the knowledge that the Red Cross actively endeavors to be sure that the data are used appropriately. But as you can hear, it can be a very slippery slope. It can be easy for situations to arise where biometric registration is misused. In other cases, such as a contentious collaboration of the Palantir Corporation, you've probably come across Palantir, they run security systems in countries throughout the world, but that doesn't stop them being a questionable corporation. They work sometimes with the World Food Program, but many worry that inappropriate surveillance can occur, that there may be bias in the data use, or that the standards of other clients whose activities undermine humanitarianism might affect the World Food Program, or the outcomes of the World Food Program. At a very basic level, that corporation, Palantir, sought to partner with the World Food Program mainly to retrieve its reputation. In other words, Palantir has been criticized for its security activities because it's a popular company that is used for security purposes, as I say, in many countries. And there have been some controversies about their methods, let's say. And so some argue that Palantir went into humanitarian aid to try to improve their own reputation rather than out of any interest in the actual activities that were being done on behalf of those who are refugees and people in transit. And so many worried that Palantir was simply aid washing their activities. So the ambivalence of surveillance is again evident in these examples. So we've said some things about data-driven surveillance, surveillance capitalism, and the ways in which these somewhat abstract sounding ideas can actually have a direct effect on people's life chances in cases of national security, which we haven't gone into much detail, just a few examples, but predictive policing and also humanitarian aid. So those are the those are some of the areas in which it's worth thinking about questions of um, surveillance in a big data world, because the questions that we've been raising about it in a general way and in a way that is in your direct experience as users of social media platforms and many other kinds of platforms. Also, the rubber hits the road in matters like predictive policing and biometric registration in particular, in situations of great need among displaced people. So certainly in extreme situations like international aid for displaced folks, like predictive policing that is frequently directing police to areas of already existing social inequality, and so on, you can see that there are very human repercussions beyond, being sent some ad for some thing that you didn't really want, which is hardly a major problem compared with the sorts of things that I've just been talking about. On the other hand, those rather trivial transactional situations that we all find ourselves in as users of the internet can also become very serious themselves. So I'm not trivializing the ways in which we ourselves use these surveillance capitalist systems in everyday life. I'm just pointing out that there are situations in which there are much more vulnerable people than we likely are, who can well be affected quite negatively by these things, especially if they lack regulation, if they haven't been thought through in an ethical fashion, and if the agencies that have been seeking them, like police trying to reduce the costs of policing, will switch to some automated system that they think is going to, just create a wonderful new world where they have far less costs and many more immediate results. Could be highly risky, in fact. So I'm not leaving you with very good news before the weekend, but unfortunately, the world of surveillance is a pretty mixed world. I've tried to be clear about the ways in which a surveillance of care and a surveillance for human flourishing is not impossible, but I'm also offering a warning that the kinds of surveillance that are developing today are not all good, and we have to be aware of them, and we have to be working to, in my view, try to minimize the damage and to find ways of redirecting such surveillance systems. And those are responsibilities for all of us as citizens, as human beings. So we'll leave it there for tonight, and I hope I will see you on Monday evening. And I also hope that you have a really good weekend between now and then. Great. Thanks a lot. Yep.
Personally, enjoy all of this so far. So, for the question you made up, it's everything's all right. And second, I do think it's nice thing for everyone that you are more than welcome to comment medical and moral problems, just like you hold back on commenting on computer science and data bias. This is your personal opinion, even though. And third, it's more than a personal question, but if your work would fit in the definition of the late stage capitalism, or is not like.
Sure.
Yeah.
Good question. Good question. And okay, we could also talk about opinions, because I hope I don't say anything that I can't back up with a good argument that comes from good sources, that is reliable. Of course, like any professor, I have my views on things, And as I've been candid with you, I am pretty committed to some things. And those things, yeah, certainly have to do with ethical and political questions. And therefore, they're bound to be contentious because not everybody is going to agree with me. And nor do I expect everyone to agree with me. But, you know, I take your point. And anyway, I will look forward to seeing you, Federico, and see you on okay.
Thank you all. We'll see each other next week.